So, good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on circular economy and autonomous mobility. We are very pleased to have Professor Joseph Sarkis with us today, a renowned expert in the area of sustainable supply chain management. I will give a brief bio and then hand over to Professor Sarkis. Professor Sarkis is a management professor within the business school at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. He earned his PhD from the University of Buffalo. His scholarly interests include ecological sustainability, technology, operations, and supply chain management. He has authored hundreds of publications and is also on the editorial board of various journals in the area. He is also an international program coordinator for the Greening of Industry Network, along with Springer Nature Greening of Industry Network book series co-editor. He co-chairs the Future Earth Circular Economy Working Group. Professor Sarkis has been recognized as one of the most influential global scholars in general business management, as well as in the areas of supply chain management, corporate sustainability, operations research, and sustainable supply chains. He currently holds the chair, the Excellence TECLOGD, which stands for Transport Technology, Circular Economy, and Sustainable Supply Chains at the Université Polytechnique Hauts-de-France. When you have a chance, pursue his most recent edited two-volume major reference work on supply chain management for Palgrave Macmillan. Currently, he is at Shanghai Jiaotong University as a visiting scholar for the fall of 2024 and will be a Rachel Carson visiting scholar at Chatham University in Pittsburgh later in fall of 2024. So it is my pleasure as president of Canadian Operations Research Society to welcome Professor Sarkis, and I hand over to him for his presentation. Thank you very much, Professor Sarkis, for
Thank
accepting
you,
our.
Anjali, for inviting me and having me. Right now, I am in China. So if my connection goes off a little bit, I apologize beforehand. I'm in my hotel. It's in the evening, and I'm hoping that internet traffic is not so bad. And thank you for joining me on your first thing Monday morning, because I know it's 9 o'clock on the East Coast in the North America. Okay, so this is my title, and it is Emergent Challenges, Opportunities, and Theories for the Circular Economy. And essentially, it's going over a number of topics that I have studied over the last few years related to circular economy and digitization primarily, and how it's evolved. And of course, the past few years includes the COVID time period. And we have some lessons from that period. And we're still learning, looking back on those lessons. As a matter of fact, we published another paper looking at algorithm aversion due to disruption, but that's a different issue. This is more sustainability oriented. What you see here are some of my books that go back to the turn of the century or the early millennium to modern day. And the Palgrave Handbook over here is a two-volume set of supply chain management topics, about 60 chapters if you're interested in the various topics in the area. My agenda, and given that we still have a relatively small group here, you can interrupt me for a clarification in the middle of thought, and we'll get back to the presentation afterward, is that as follows: environment and sustainability, a few philosophical and background points, because this group here, I don't know how much you are familiar with the sustainability topics, given it's more operations research. I do know that operations research, though, has been very active in natural environmental issues, business and the environment. So I wouldn't be surprised if you know some of these items already. I also take a little bit of a levels and boundaries perspective to give a general perspective on sustainability issues and how they relate to each other. And then eventually a little bit of background on sustainable supply chains and circular economy. And this little bit of background could expand to be days worth of discussion, but I will try to be as brief as possible. And then from that, this is where we get into some of the digitization issues. I will be looking from an eco-technical resilience theoretical backdrop, essentially saying that technology, along with environmental sustainability practices can build resilience. And that's the backdrop that I'm talking about. Speaking a little bit about technology as a solution and what we learned from COVID, as I mentioned, and the relationships to the SDGs. And part of the relationships to the SDGs is an emerging topic or area that I'm considering about co-benefits. And I kind of mentioned co-benefits very early on, because what we're facing here are challenges that could be considered very complex and that need special solutions. And I will go over some of the aspects of those. And of course, with the closure, we can have a little discussion at the very end. And that's the agenda. Now, going back to the beginning again, greening and environmental sustainability. Notice I used the term greening and environmental sustainability, not just sustainability. Sustainability has many different definitions, as we'll see then this whole area of the fields of these grand challenges, circular economy, sustainable supply chains, depending on your perspective, the definitions could be very different. So we need to start out with some initial definitions. Sustainability has two major popular definitions: the intergenerational philosophy, and this is a famous quote from the Brundtland Commission report. It's essentially meeting today's needs or the needs of today's generation without compromising future generations' ability to meet their needs. And this is called intergenerational philosophy because philosophers are arguing over this point themselves. Do we really have to worry about future generations? This is a question they've been asking. And if so, how would we do that? But this is what we believe. So we don't want to dirty our environment for future generations or use up all our resources that future generations would require. The issue here is we don't know what our future generations are going to value. We don't know their technology. We don't know your development. So anything we do could be either good or bad. Even trying to save the earth in climate change could be good or bad, depending on what future generations want, but we don't know what they want. So there's that whole philosophical discussion. The other definition of sustainability is the triple bottom line ideas. And economic, environmental, social, economic, environment, everyone, planet, profits, people, the three dimensions of sustainability that are very popular and well cited and used often, as well as the intergenerational philosophy. One of them is testable. You could develop dimensions, and operations researchers really like dimensions because then you could use multi-criteria. You can optimize on different things, yada, yada, yada. But one of my philosophical stances and concerns as an environmentally focused researcher, and why I use greening, is that the term sustainability clouds the issues. And I even wrote a short article a number of years ago when people started shifting over, scholars and practitioners shifting over from environmental to sustainability. And in that case, what I saw essentially was that sustainability was hiding environmental issues. Of course, most of us think of environmental issues, sustainability, but organizations, people, researchers tend to put environmental issues maybe at equal levels if we're lucky with economic and social issues. But typically, environmental social issues, economic and social issues, take on greater importance because they're both associated with anthropocentric or man-made philosophies. And the environment gets lost when that discussion starts because they use the general term sustainability. So this is why I always start out my presentation saying, is sustainability good for the environment? Which is an interesting take. And again, I'm not the first one to think about that. Others have thought about it as well. And I just keep repeating that issue because I lived through the time period when corporate environmental management all of a sudden came corporate social responsibility, corporate sustainability, and the word environment, natural environment, ecological environment was lost. So these are the litany of problems that organizations man, society has to be concerned with. And this is only a short list. And the interesting thing about this list is I have not changed it for over 30 years. This is the same list that I've always had. And you know what? A lot of these issues, almost every single one remains in some form. And this is 30, 35 years worth of research that we're all saying, oh, we're doing great things and everybody's listening to us. We're doing all this research. I remain relatively skeptical about how much. Yeah, some progress has been made, but we forget about other things maybe that we've regressed on. And I just put this up there. The real reason I put this up there is to also show that there's a level of analysis going on here. And this is one of the themes that I typically have. Systems is one theme, of course. The other theme I have is multiple levels of analysis that can be done. And there's an interaction among these levels of analysis. So if you're thinking about optimizing, be careful how you optimize because there's global optimization and local optimization, as you know. And optimizing some things can also hurt other things, and there's trade-offs associated with some of the things. But I'm also taking a more positive perspective, a more optimistic perspective, saying not only are there trade-offs, but there's synergies, positive synergies, a co-benefits. And I'll come back to that idea because I really like the co-benefits idea and something that we should be pursuing more often instead of saying there's always a trade-off between the two, economics or the three, economic, social, and environmental issues. And here is the latest, and you want a definition of sustainability. One of the latest sustainable terms, and many of you are probably familiar with this. This is the United Nations Sustainability Goals, and there's 17 goals, and there's like a couple hundred indicators and measures and so on. So if you like measures and indicators and want to do multiple criteria or multiple optimization, there's many, many, many measures here. The difficulty is a lot of these work against each other in some way, although some are synergistic. And we'll come back to that idea later, but there is a lot of complexity here is what I want to show, that sustainability has gained in complexity as we've matured in understanding sustainability concerns. And nowadays, we're calling them, at least in the management field, in the business field, maybe in other fields as well, grand challenges. And a grand challenge is based on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And going back to management science, there's an article in Management Science back in 1969 70, 1970, that essentially was a perspective article by Churchman. And he essentially introduced the term wicked problem. And now wicked problems, and the reason why he introduced the wicked problems is because he was saying operations researchers at that time, management scientists, they have these great mathematical models that can do all of these things, and they have great properties and solutions and everything. Unfortunately, they can't really solve these wicked grand challenge problems. And no model can. But you have to recognize that and maybe consider a multitude of models. And there's a lot more multitude of models using multiple approaches, soft computing methodologies these days. Of course, the top journals still want to see the mathematics, and it's rare that you'll see a multi-methodological approach being published in the top journals, mostly because you can't prove optimality in many of those cases. But they are worthwhile to pursue because companies can then run a series of models to look at different perspectives. But not only companies, there's policymakers, there's decision makers, there's communities, NGOs that could use these models as well. So when you're putting these ideas together, think about the many constituencies, the many stakeholders that are involved that have to be considered in any optimization, any decision making, any kind of mathematics that you might use if you're looking from an operations research perspective. I look more broadly than that, but that is something to be considered. And a lot of wicked problems have trade-offs. There's something called paradox theory that's very popular now that says, look, you got to expect trade-offs to be occurring. And I'm saying, but there's also co-benefits. There's synergies, complementarities that help each other out. Most talk about the negative relationships that exist. And at the Academy Management they were saying, "Oh yeah, you got to consider the trade-offs." And we asked experts about the trade-offs involved, and I raised my hand. I said, "Have you talked about the co-benefits involved? Was that part of the discussion?" And they said, "Well, not necessarily." And I said, "Well," and then somebody jumped up and said, "Yes, we did. We had like 3 or 4 workshops. One of the workshops actually was looking at a positive view. It's called appreciative approach." And they said, and the results were very different. I said, "There, you've got a paper there." They were looking at the trade-offs discussion and paradox theory, and I'm thinking, what about the positive people, the ones who are optimistic? That's how you really sell these solutions. Everybody, as you know, in the United States, we're having an election right now, is very much, heads banging each other, saying, "Oh, you guys don't know, da, da, da." But there are co-benefits, and that's something that we should be taking a look at. What about being positive? And I'm recommending a co-benefits theory, but this comes out of economics, with there's ideas of complementarity theory, whereas paradox is substitutability. So are these some things complements, synergies, and are some of them substitutes? And identifying when something is a complement can be just as vital as when there's something substitute, and how do you make the trade-offs, like in break-even analysis, something. I leave that up only as a philosophical discussion, not what I'm going to really talk about, although I spent a few minutes talking about it already. Now, back to environmental issues. And I have here as background material, my list actually over the years has gotten deeper and longer. And there's many different things, all the way from the basics. Make sure you follow the laws. That's always been there. Well, actually, it hasn't always been there. If you look at the history of environmental regulations, it really didn't have teeth in it until maybe the 1970s, in the United States at least, and the rest of the world by definition. Before that, there was court proceedings and so on, tort law that managed it. You sued companies because of these things. But now there's regulations where the government can take the role of the people and the communities to make sure everything's good. So there's a lot of topics that exist, and a topic keeps listing. ESG, we were talking a little bit, Anjali, earlier about ESG, essentially the performance metrics, financial performance. There's a lot of problems with them. There's reporting, there's circularity, which actually we were doing for a long time. You'll see a little bit of circularity right from the beginning, actually, for 30, 40 years. But it's finally taken off after 30 years or so. And something called due diligence, which is really interesting. The due diligence laws in Europe essentially are saying that companies are responsible with penalties, with teeth, for whatever damages somebody deep in their supply chain does. That is a very different thing, because now these companies that buy a lot from the supply chain and would be held responsible if someone is dirtying, or social issues arise somewhere, companies in Europe will be responsible. It's still in the early stages, but this gets into the sustainable supply chain ideas that we've been discussing. Now there is some more motivation, not just reputational motivations, but actual fines and penalties, coercive reasons why companies need to be sustainable and have a sustainable supply chain. I'm keeping my eye out on that. That might be something you'd want to consider in any models at a future time. Now, as I mentioned before, boundaries and analysis. Oh, one of the things that I've started to do is I've started to learn how to use QR codes. So if you want to see this paper, Sarkis 2012, just hit the QR code. I'm using digital technology here. I practice what I preach. Okay,
Yeah, they're
so
very much needed.
so you could do this and get the paper up there. Plus, it might increase my citations, because now they can find the paper much more easily. You got to think about this whole situation. But anyway, this paper talks about green supply chain management from a boundaries and flows perspective. And what I'm saying here, and this is something that you'll see in some of my research as well, and some of the definitions, especially from a circular economy perspective, is there are multiple levels of analysis for the circular economy. And depending on the level of analysis, different models, different theories can be applied. And at the very end, you'll see the culmination of all of these potential theories that exist out there to study this if you're a management theorist or a business or economic theorist. If somebody says you need a theoretical framework or perspective, I've got loads of them for you. You can just look at some of those and say, oh, yeah, you could look at it from that perspective. And the good thing about theories is that you can look at multiple perspectives and you could try to separate those perspectives from other theories. Okay, so this is a boundaries levels analysis. And this is my traditional model that I use to describe the green supply chain. This is a standard supply chain activities, upstream and downstream. And what I'm showing here, and I'm going to go very quickly because this essentially shows the various complexities and environmental issues that you have to deal with, beginning with upstream vendors, vendor management, green supply chain, green supplier selection. All of these topics come into play, criteria. A lot of them, of course, I have dealt with from game theoretic or multi-criteria decision-making perspective, but there's many, many other ways of doing it from an empirical regression tools perspective as well. I moved on a little bit to energy. Now, to make the supply chain going, energy is a big role player in climate change. And to run any supply chain requires that you have energy involved. And this is what's causing a lot of the climate change problems. So there's different aspects of that you can research. There is cleaner production research. This is where I began a lot of my early research, right in production. I was an operations and production person primarily. And then I said, let's look at environmentally conscious manufacturing. This was back in the early 1990s when I was talking about environmentally conscious manufacturing. Environmental, not green, environmental, not sustainable, environmental. Again, the terminology had changed during that period. And then logistics and transportation, I moved into that area with supply chain management. And this was very early on when supply chain management was just getting picked up. I didn't have this as a supply chain management term. I just had this as operations, transportation, logistics, marketing. When you bring them all together, that's supply chain, of course. Waste management, the other side. And one of the things with circular economy that we've always been trying to say is there's no such thing as waste. Eventually, this will be used or consumed in some way. Even if it's disposed of, it may stay in a landfill for thousands, tens of thousands of years, but we don't know. In the future, maybe future generations will be mining our waste. So maybe we should make more waste for them. I don't know. That's what the future generational thing has to be concerned about. And of course, closing the loop is essentially taking this forward logistics item and adding reverse logistics. And the field of reverse logistics has had thousands of articles, and it's essential for a circular economy. And in a way, some circular practices require reverse logistics and transportation. And all of this could have been the first one, is based on design principles and appropriate designs. And we'll come back to that, saying this is probably the most important and highest issue in all of sustainability is appropriate design and thinking. And that's where behavior comes into play as well. Okay, there's also boundaries. And this is the other part this is the same paper from 2012. And I introduced these boundaries issues because I'm saying, look, these aren't theoretical perspectives. These are more practical perspectives. And I had like 9 boundaries. You could probably think about 10 more boundaries. And the way I think about boundaries is there's different aspects of what managers, organizations, policymakers have to consider, depending on the level of analysis you're doing. And we have things like political, informational boundaries. And I mentioned here temporal boundaries. Time is a boundary. And in that case, if you're considering like emissions into a factory floor, these emissions would have to be controlled. And it can be toxic emissions, dangerous to people. They would have to be controlled at the minute to minute, second to second level. They have to be, or somebody could die. Okay. Now, we also have broader temporal items like climate change. We've been talking about climate change since the Industrial Revolution began, 200 years about. And now we're still talking about it. And that's because the time factor is very long, although we're seeing what's occurring now or what has been occurring, and it's speeding up. But different temporal perspectives mean different solutions, different different levels of crises you have to consider, different ways of managing it. And this relates again to the boundaries of levels of analysis. The one that we're going to talk about more than anything else right now, although all of these come into a role, is technological boundaries. And we're going to be looking at a primary technical one that I've been working on, technological boundary, and that's the multi-stakeholder technology and specifically blockchain, but also mixed in with IoT and so on. So that's the perspective I will be taking for more of the discussion here. But let me go back to a little bit about circular economy, because some people don't know the definition of circular economy, or some people might have their perspective of the circular economy. What I'm showing here is multiple perspective over multiple years of what a circular economy can be. And researchers have also said there's about 100 more definitions than this. Okay, so this is one of the difficulties we have for doing research in sustainability and in circular economy, is finding a common ground as to what we mean by it. And if you look at my work back here, I've been kind of writing and talking about this back in 1992. This is the beginning remnants of what I was thinking at green supply chain management, this thing on the bottom right-hand side. Notice I have reverse logistics in there. I have the supply chain aspects. I didn't call it green supply chain at the time. I was calling it environmentally conscious manufacturing, because supply chain management wasn't really broadly adopted in these early stages. As a matter of fact, the term supply chain management, I think, first appeared in the literature in 1989. It's not that long ago. And now it's like one of the most popular topics in business schools, to show you how the ideas evolve over time as well. But we may have been doing it, we just didn't call it that before. Okay, so what you see here is that even in 1992, I had this diagram. But you know what? Here's a secret, or not a secret. Here's a little confession. This isn't all originally mine. I borrowed this from others who were published this in 1980s, in 1970s, just to show you that the ideas aren't really new. It's just little tweaks and improvements. And more recently, the improvements look really good. Look at the butterfly diagram. See, the graphics went from these boxes and arrows to nice figures. That's because they have better diagrams, but the ideas are still the same. And in the 2006 to 2008, this is actually one paper that I wrote around. We started writing in 2006 with a colleague from China who introduced me. He said, you know, you've got colleagues in China, Professor Gong and Professor Zhu, who are looking into circular economy. I said, circular economy, tell me a bit more about this. And he said, this is a policy set by the Chinese government back in 2003 for them to save resources as well as energy. And this is circular economy. And what we wrote, because there was a call for papers on sustainability and information systems, is how to use information technology to support the circular economy, digitization in the circular economy, essentially, back in 2006. Again, the ideas are being adopted widely now, but they're not necessarily new. And you can go back even 20 more years before that. And they were talking about these principles and how can computerization and modeling and all these things help this environment. Just to show you that these ideas have been rehashed, although they have been improved. I'm not going to say they haven't been improved, but the remnants have always been there in some form. And down here, you'll see other models that we've used, that I've used in my research. And one of the ones is the 2022 article. And you see at the top there, we'll come back to that article a little bit with the rethinking. Levels of analysis, as I mentioned, complexities involved in the circular economy. And one of the things that I've been going to is, well, I used to have 3 levels: micro, meso, and macro. Those were the circular economy ideas that we started in the early 2000s, and those still take being very popular as dimensions. But then I got into the nano level. This is where basic science comes into play, modeling of science, atoms and molecules, and how we get bacteria to be involved in the circular economy. And I got this interested because we started discussing, and my provost came to me and said, Joe, what are you doing here with this and this? And I said, well, it's a little bit of recycling and so on. And some biologist came to me and says, look, there's ways of using bacteria to recycle metals and minerals. What they do is the bacteria can eat these, and then you squeeze the bacteria and you get all the metal residue or cellulose residue out of them, and then you could recycle them even further. And I thought, wow, that's crazy. So there's all these things with bioleaching that occur, and that scientists at biological and physical levels and chemical levels are considering this. It's not just managers and supply chain managers and policy. You've got the whole spectrum. I just wanted to show you that there's a lot more to circular economy than just business operations and supply chains. Okay, but there's also critiques. It's a great thing. It can solve a lot of problems. And we'll get to the solutions. We're going to be more positive than this person is. Korvelik really said, look here, the circularity is a mess. We really don't know what we're talking about. And we're throwing out all of these principles and ideas without really looking at the true feasibility. And there's levels of analysis. There's unclear, there's theory. Everybody's talking about it, talking past each other. If you're an economist, you're talking this way. If you're a scientist, you're talking this way. If you're a business person, you're talking that way. We have to be more cognizant of how we use the term. I'm not going to give you what term I'm using right now. I'm just going to say I'm using circular economy, but we have to be more cognizant. And of course, the implementation is not so easy. And this is something that we're discussing right now, transitioning to the circular economy and how feasible, what can we transition when, and so on, that needs to be done. And it's an essentially contested concept. An essentially contested concept means that it's very political, because essentially contested concepts come from politics. An economist will view it from this perspective, as I mentioned. A community person will be viewing it from this perspective, and a environmentalist will be viewing it from a completely different perspective as well. And they'll be pushing that perspective. Economists will say this helps the economy. Environmentalists will say this helps the environment or hurts the environment. And NGOs will say, and society will say, it generates more jobs. And all of those arguments have been used for circular economy. And this is one of the ideas that we did. And there's the article there. It's a very practical article. It's not scientific in any sense of the word. This article was to say, to introduce the idea to practitioners. It was through a consulting firm publication, Amplify. And we essentially said, even circular economy can be strongly sustainable or weakly sustainable. As a matter of fact, if you practice the circular economy badly, you can actually hurt the natural environment. You could use more resources than what has originally been proposed. So it's not always good. And you have to think about it from multiple perspectives. And these gears up here are ways of extending products life, having new leasing models, dematerializing, using less, using it longer, keeping it in the system, are all propositions associated with circular systems. Now, how well you do those and how efficiently you do those, that can determine whether you're strongly sustainable or weakly sustainable. And one of the top things, as I mentioned up here, is rethink and redesign. And rethinking essentially means, do we even need this? Do we have to use this material? And do we have to behave in such a way? This is a more critical theory perspective. Now, going to the eco-resilience perspective, eco-technical resilience, I start with ecological modernization, which essentially states that technology can decouple economic growth from environmental damage. That's the perfect environment. Keep growing as much as you want economically, bring everybody up, but do less damage to the environment. And as a matter of fact, they're saying there's a regenerative thought now, saying anything we do economically should regenerate the environment, actually improve it, not do no less, not do no harm, but actually do better. And there's those theorists out there right now that are trying to do it. Is that going to work? There's a lot of skeptics. I may be one of them, but I'm not going to go there with that. One of the things that I do mention, and I'm not going to get into too much philosophical debate, is that this is the IPAT equation. Essentially says that environmental impact is a function of population, affluence, and technology. Increases in populations means more ecological damage. Increases in affluence typically mean more ecological damage. And the way to offset all that is through technology. So I'm not going to say reduce population, reduce affluence, because nobody wants to hear that. I'm going to say, let's use technology to solve those problems. That's what everybody wants to hear. Is that a true thing? There's been a debate on that for generations. And I'm not going to go over that debate anymore further. But all we do know is that the first most important sustainable development goal that I showed earlier is number one, poverty alleviation. Helping everybody get out of poverty and live a life primarily. And a major driver is economic improvement. So we can't get around from that. So we have to do a technological solution, at least from the SDG perspective. And this is one of the trade-offs, but maybe there's co-benefits involved. And that's something we're looking at later as well. And you've seen this term as well. So I'm trying to throw all the biggest buzzwords out as quick as possible. Industry 4.0, nobody knows what that is either. Yeah, it's a few robots. It's a little bit of this technology. Throw in AI. AI is really hot now. So AI has to be part of Industry 4.0. Maybe throw in, there's a nice robot there, robot arms, drones maybe, satellite, Internet of Things, whatever. And my personal favorite is a new one. It actually wasn't part of Industry 4.0 when it started, but now it is part of Industry 4.0, and that's blockchain technology. You see how the term even evolves. And whatever next technology, quantum computing, definitely part of Industry 4.0 when it gets developed and brought in. So watch out for that one. AI is already popular. It might even be decreasing a little bit in importance, but maybe not. I don't. People love AI. And it's been around for generations, by the way, if you don't know that. It's just that computers have gotten better. Algorithms have always been there. And that's part of what operations research is trying to do. But distributed manufacturing communication is easier. Distribution of manufacturing, distribution of systems, and involving more people is what it's all about. In circular economy, I borrowed this off of somebody. I forgot who I borrowed this from. It's not mine. But it has all of these different technologies that play a role. And my little contribution or focus is going to be on blockchain on the right-hand side over here. But before that, we do have a paper, Digitalization and Greening of Supply Chains. And there it is, the little QR code. And this was an invited review saying these are emergent information technologies. We also discuss in the same paper basic IT, expert systems, decision support systems, and transactional systems, management information systems, essentially. The hierarchy that I learned back in the 80s of management information systems. And what they do across the supply chain, we have the Internet of Things, we have blockchain technology and quantum computing as what I would consider evolutionary. I don't want to say revolutionary because they've been around. A lot of these have been around for a while. Internet of Things goes back, of course, to the internet, World Wide Web from even the 60s and 70s. So let's go to one of the technologies. Again, I could have gone in a different path down AI or another path, big data, or a different path, robotics, and its role to circularity and supply chain. And this is another paper. You might be familiar with this Saberi et al. From 2019's International Journal of Production Research, where we started introducing blockchain-based supply chain and sustainable supply chains. And I'm going to go very quickly through this. The blockchain is adding blocks of information that are immutable and that are available to anybody who's a member of the blockchain. And the most pure blockchain is the public blockchain, which is like Bitcoin. Everybody has access to it. And this paper here, we discuss what it is and the various characteristics. And I think we have 4 or 5 major capabilities or characteristics. Traceability, transparency of the supply chain, tokenization, incentivization in the supply chain, security, immutability, reliability, accuracy of data in the supply chain, and the efficiency of managing the supply chain. So there's a number of aspects. And what you notice here is that the blockchain, because everybody has access to it, before it was a linear one with dyadic relationships, You have one company talking to another company, talking to a different company, talking to a different company, but it was very decoupled. The information technology was shared. That was the most advanced, where they would talk to each other, purchasing or delivery, customer relationship management. What we're saying in the blockchain is visibility everywhere because of distributed ledger technology. And anybody within the supply chain can see where their product or material has gone throughout. That's the theoretical ideal situation. Oh, smart contracts. That's the efficiency aspect. That's what I meant by the fourth thing. That smart contracts can take and make transactions easier, transactions that don't have checks and so on, that have already been built in, and somehow organizations are able to meet the criteria. They might bid on something, or they might give a price or ask for a certain price. When it's met by anybody, then the transaction occurs. And transactions mean capital transactions, material transactions, whatever transactions are necessary. Not all blockchains have all these characteristics. For example, smart contracts only came on board with Ethereum, not part of Bitcoin, their platform. So then what we did was we wrote a paper around blockchain. I think we began this in 2017 and got it published in 2018. And we said, let me take that model. Let's take this old model we had for green supply chains and say, how do we use blockchain activities and blockchain characteristics to help out across the supply chain? And we give a number of things: traceability, emissions trading you could do through the blockchain, peer-to-peer exchange through the blockchain, reverse location, tracing materials, reverse logistics, tracing locations, sustainable performance, transparency throughout your supply chain. One of the earliest blockchain applications was Provenance, and that showed that as well. So we find this, and we provide a number of potential ideas, and we were brainstorming here. This is very conceptual. There's a couple examples of actual practice. Unfortunately, one of the biggest issues that we faced, and this is kind of what we said are barriers to blockchain, is that we really couldn't find one, and we still really can't find a working blockchain that's publicly available that everybody knows about as a success. The one was TradeLens at one time, and it went out of business, a year and a half ago or something. It's still got a ways to go, and we even did another paper on the barriers and issues related to blockchain technology. But one of the papers that we worked on back in 2019, getting published in 2019, but coming out in 2020. And that's this paper here, Production Planning and Control, where we did a secondary search. And this was still very early on, a lot of pilot studies, a lot of demonstrations. And we were showing at the time where, using the Resolve model, one of the models of circular economy, where blockchain was being used and how it was being used. And we saw that most of it is for efficiency, and transparency and traceability. That was the darkest one there, optimization. And this is part of the Resolve model. I'm not going to go over the Resolve model, but it's to show you that it's been very specific where companies have been using blockchain characteristics from blockchain. They haven't even been using all the various capabilities of blockchain in this situation. And then we did another further study. And in this case, we used a different definition of circular economy. On the left-hand side are circular economy practices, our performance metrics, we should say. And this is from the EU or EC, European Community's definition of circular economy. We took that and we asked a series of experts, from these blockchain characteristics, where do you think the greatest potential or greatest use of blockchain could be for managing performance in the circular economy? Why performance? Because you needed indicators to help further advance the circular economy. And we did this study, and it was just a simple survey. Where do you think? We asked a whole bunch of questions. We had experts that we had to identify. It was a very much convenient sample. They had to be relatively well-versed in circular economy and in blockchain technology. That wasn't too many people, by the way, at that time in 2018-19. But we found enough people to give us their opinions. And we found that incentivization and tokenization, motivating people, motivating companies to do things, was probably the strongest way to get them to use performance or to develop performance measures in the supply chain. That's the basic outcome of this. There's a lot more in there, and we have more in the paper, but that's just one of the things. And then came the COVID crisis. Notice the timing here. I'm building up timing. 2020 comes along, and the world shuts down, and and all of us were starting to write, what's going on? What are we going to do? What does this mean for the supply chain? What does this mean for everything? What does it mean for sustainable supply chains? Because when the COVID came along, the world became more sustainable. Wasn't that weird? You saw those pictures of animals walking in the streets, clear skies over Delhi. It was like crazy stuff was going on. And we said, look, if we could change this quickly for a crisis, why can't we change for the global climate crisis, for all our environmental crises? We didn't die out. Yeah, the economy slowed down a little bit, but we didn't die out. Things got, in some ways, a little better, a little less bad. And as a matter of fact, the remnants still exist. We don't want to go back to work. We want to work from home. A lot of us do, at least, especially if you're an academic. Well, he said, oh, wow. I didn't realize it was so good because you got your home set up and everything. We learned from this. It changed work life. It could have changed the sustainability, but we're kind of skeptical about it. And this is the skepticism we had. So we had a discussion, and we wrote a paper. There's ways of learning from this crisis. And we wrote 3 or 4 papers for opportunities. I don't know if anybody listened, but they did get highly cited. But I don't know if they're listening. They were highly cited by other academics, like-minded academics, but industry, we don't know. This gets into the whole issue of we as researchers, are we really making a difference, even though our work gets highly cited? I don't know. Maybe we will. Anyway, I had another paper that said, look at the COVID crisis introduces us to social as well as technological innovations. And my argument between social innovations, technological innovations, is circular economy as a social innovation, technological innovations, distancing, blockchain, all of these things could play a role from the learnings we had from COVID. And this paper discusses some of those. And that's why I came back to circular economy. That's why I'm mentioning COVID here, because there was some lessons learned there. And one of the lessons are, can blockchain technology and circular economy resources and capabilities help us become more resilient to crises through localization, agility, and digitization? And that was a basic premise we had when we started doing another paper. And we said, let's take a look at these companies that somehow did things in COVID a little bit differently. And we looked at them and said, did these different things lead to localization? Localization, by the way, is a sustainability practice, but it's also a resilience practice. You don't have to rely on global supply chains. Agility could be a sustainability practice, but it's very much a flexibility issue. And can you be flexible enough to manage and build resilience in your supply chain? And digitization. And we then plotted these using qualitative analysis. All of us started coding all these cases and so on of different companies doing different things. And we said, yeah, the further you go down with BCT resources and capabilities, blockchain technology, and the more circular economy resources, the more you actually become localized and agile, as well as digitalized because of the blockchain technology, clearly, or support other digitalization tools. And this paper discusses how we went through it. It was very qualitative. What we came up with was more questions than answers. And we came up with these propositions that could still and should still be evaluated in some way. We only said this was an outcome from our qualitative relationship, but there's a bunch of propositions that really need further investigation. We're going to say everything we mentioned here is tentative, it's exploratory, and I'm assuming that people are now using it because we're getting cited. So maybe different elements of this are being investigated further. At least we gave people an idea to do this. Now, the other aspect of the circular economy that we need are the resources and managing resources. And we wrote a paper, started thinking about colleague and fire management and so on, and safety issues related to the circular economy. And this is another article here that talks about safety issues in the circular economy because the circular economy has enough barriers. One of the barriers are safety concerns, especially with lithium-ion batteries, that it can explode anywhere and cause fires anywhere in the supply chain or damage. And this has gotten from an industry relationship. We did some more research on it. We asked managers, we asked experts in the field to give us using best worst method techniques. And this is another paper that's appeared in Resources Conservation Recycling to help rank and evaluate the importance of different safety issues throughout the supply chain, including the circular portion or reverse logistics, because we wanted to do recycling because recycling was very important to make sure our materials grow. And we developed this that just came out, IJPR, a blockchain safety, a blockchain architecture that we're programming still to conceptual models with more research questions. We come back to the sustainable development goals and say digitization can support all of these, building resilience and so on. And these are the theories I promised you. There's so many theoretical perspectives to be looked at. And we got this from the actual literature, by the way, that are looking at various things, and we kind of brought them together. This paper is still under review, crossing our fingers at under second revision. You know, you never know. And I have a paper there that talks about blockchain and the theories involved in blockchain. This is not this paper, but a different paper. And blockchain, questions and directions, multi-stakeholder technology, who should be involved, go do co-benefits. You can do co-benefits with using technology to determine it. Transportation and logistics designs are going to be critical for a circular economy. And I didn't even talk about those issues, but those are things that operations researchers and others could be involved with. So study, teach, and outreach are important things in a multi-stakeholder technology. Now, I'm sorry for running a little bit later than I wanted to. I was hoping to get done about 10 minutes ago, but I get carried away. Okay. I think that's it, Anjali.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Sarkis. Such a nice presentation. I got so many ideas while hearing you and seeing your slides. Thank you very much. So now I open the floor to audience, and you are welcome to ask questions to Professor Sarkis.
May I start?
Yes, please.
Hi, Professor Sarkis. First of all, I just wanted to thank you for your presentation. Huge fan of your work, actually. My research primarily focuses on the field of sustainability assessment frameworks. Looking at
so I'm preaching to the choir, essentially, right? Okay.
A lot of what you said that definitely resonated. Starting off my research actually in the field of sustainability supply chains, but then I shifted gears more towards the measurement systems and looking more thoroughly through that. I guess my question stems from what were the challenges that you saw in terms of measuring sustainability across supply chains with an organization?
Yeah, the measurement issue is a very big issue. And there's, I think we should be studying the behavior of performance measurement rather than performance measurement models and theories and so on, but actual behavior of how do organizations use performance measures, and why do they use certain performance measures and not other performance measures. And a lot of that relates probably to what is incentivized within the organization. If sustainability is incentivized, what aspect of sustainability takes the highest priority? There's theoretical or ideal ones. Oh, yeah, we balance all three performance measures. When in reality, we all know it comes down to one, and that's economics. So I'm kind of skeptical about all the different performance measures that we're using for environmental. And I'm the biggest proponent of performance measures for environmental. But maybe it's not used in a way that it's used in a way that increases economic performance. And that is the driver. And as a matter of fact, our research is 90% of the research that relates performance measures of environmental stuff relates it to economic performance, because that's how companies are really measured. As a matter of fact, it took a long time for environmental performance measures to become a measure of how well we do environmental practices. It was kind of weird. It wasn't until like 2013, 14, they kept saying everybody's relating environmental performance to financial performance. But what about environmental performance or environmental practices to environmental performance? What the purpose of environmental things are. And the data's not very easy to get in those cases. We did it. We've done it in many different ways. And even now, one of our papers on circular economy is many people look at circular economy practice. Does it relate to performance, organizational, financial performance? That's been done. But we found it very hard to look at circular economy practices to actual circular economy outcomes. And we're right now putting we put a paper together that's under review right now that we said, does circular economy practices relate to circular economy outcomes? Is recycling practices relate to increased recycling? That's the basic question in corporations. We haven't found much research on it. That's surprising, isn't it? So that's how you start a paper out.
Yeah.
If you said today, look at it, this is the reason why we're doing it, and we haven't found anything. Yeah, but what is my idea about it? I don't know. I'm moving into a new area of performance metrics, and something I kind of alluded to very quickly in one of the slides. What is the relationship between circular economy and biodiversity? Think about it. It really isn't that clear. At best, it's indirect. And the major reason why we're not studying it is because we don't know what measures exist for biodiversity. And how are you going to determine biodiversity across the supply chain? That's an area that I'm looking at right now with a few colleagues. It's been difficult. It's been 2 or 3 years we've been looking at it. We still haven't really come up to an answer. So I'm not sure if I answered your question there.
So, I mean, we could go on for hours. I think it's such a challenging topic around, first of all, understanding your measurement, making sure that it's linked to the objective and that you're measuring the right thing.
Thank you, Sarah. For the purpose of time, I will take one more question and then we will head to another speaker. Minnie has a question for the speaker. Minnie, are you there? She's asking, what are the future research directions for the topic of blockchain and circular economy? How can we ensure that current blockchain research can be applied to businesses?
That's an excellent question in terms of how can it be applied to businesses. One of the difficulties we have, as I mentioned earlier, is that we can apply it. I'm recommending hundreds of ways. We've written papers about it. How many is business really going to take on? That's a different question. One of the studies we did, and it's kind of interesting, is the issue about transparency in the blockchain. We're thinking, oh yeah, they want to adopt a blockchain. Everybody wants to do that because it's such a great tool. So the more blockchain, and we did this as an experiment, believe it or not, using discrete choice models, or discrete choice conjoint models. And we thought, oh, the more blockchain, the higher the utility, right? That's what we thought. What occurred was, it went up a little bit, but then it went down with more transparency or more blockchain. And the idea here is that maybe organizations don't want to be so transparent. You understand why? Because it can make them look bad, and people can have information about them that they could use against them because this information on the blockchain, supposedly, nobody could ever change it. So everybody could go back through the history of this organization, point out bad things that they did in the past that they never improved upon in the future. So transparency, which we believed was a good thing, for some stakeholders it is. But for other stakeholders, like the businesses involved, they don't want people to have transparency and visibility into their supply chains. Those are competitive advantages they might have. So can it be how research can be applied? And to determine these little nuances of, we're saying blockchain is the greatest thing because you can do all these things, but businesses don't think so. And this is something we have to find a middle ground on. What are businesses willing to share and use the blockchain for, and what things are not? It might be something that we'd have to iron out eventually. That's one of the aspects. Blockchain and circular economy, I mentioned a couple of them up there. I think, for example, there's we did a paper, Su Tian and myself, we did one for embodied environmental dimensions in the supply chain. And there's different ways of doing environmental research and information. life cycle analysis, material flows analysis, and energy analysis, something that we've been pushing for a while, which essentially gives us how much value, environmental value in products throughout a supply chain. And how the circular economy can come into that as well. Well, we'll talk about the circular economy, but that embodied value can grow as you add value to a product or material. And by the end of the life, maybe we should be considering those items with the highest embodied value as ones that should be highly more prioritized in the circular economy. And that is one way of relating. And there's 100 other ways, which we won't get into right now, but those are just a couple examples. And again, if you sit around and brainstorm and discuss these issues a lot more, you can find a lot more solutions as well as barriers to blockchain technology for the circular economy.
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Sarkis. This brings our first presentation to an end, and you are very welcome to reach Professor Sarkis by email or visit his website. Thank you so much once again. Now I will move to the second speaker of today, who are going to present on right-sizing innovation, merging policy, technology, and future-ready infrastructure. Our speakers are Matthew Davis and Greg Rodriguez from Stantec USA. Greg is a nationally recognized subject matter expert for policy, regulatory, and legal issues related to transportation and innovation. He uses his unique legal, regulatory, and policy experience to assist clients with the development of policies and operational frameworks focused on the safe and effective deployment of transportation technologies into communities across the country, including demand-responsive mobility, automated and connected vehicles, unmanned drones, and zero-emission vehicles. His services to clients include the completion of comprehensive policy and regulatory analysis to identify barriers to the deployment of technology-focused solutions and recommended frameworks focused on the incorporation of flexible and data-driven governance structures that also consider infrastructure needs to support implementation. He is also a co-founder of the Mobility Podcast. He is accompanied by Matthew Davis from Stantec USA as well. Matthew is working collaboratively across disciplines to deliver transformational infrastructure projects that leverage technology to improve the safety and operations of our transportation networks. His background covers the complete project lifecycle, where his understanding of operations and maintenance informs planning efforts that in turn informs analysis, design, and integration of new systems. Matt understands that the ITS, intelligent transportation systems, solutions deployed in the field ultimately need to be maintainable and need to be both useful and intuitive for the operators in the TMC in order to meet the goal of our clients. He has delivered dozens of ITS projects across the country, overcoming a variety of challenges through unique and targeted solutions. So we are very delighted to have Greg and Matthew with us today, who are known experts in the field of autonomous mobility, and we all look forward to hearing them on how autonomous vehicles and related policies are going to shape our coming days. Thank you very much, and I pass on to Greg and Matthew for their talk.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Aswathi. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
And is my screen showing the right thing?
Yes.
You see presentation mode? All right. That's half the battle with technology. So thank you for the invitation. Matt and I are really excited to be here. Even the first conversation you were just having was spot on. And I think the questions that I was able to hear really merge with what Matt and I are hoping to talk about today with our presentation, and really thinking about how do you merge this conversation with the challenges you were just talking around blockchain. So there's a research side of things, which is fantastic. And then there's the implementation side of things. And then there's this conversation around technology, how to actually make it a part of the new business ecosystem. How do you show the value in maybe slowing down and thinking about performance measures and setting them? But then also, how do you stay adaptable and flexible to be able to integrate them in a way that one keeps up with kind of the changing goals I think we have as we learn more about technology, and then the actual deployment of the technology and how it proves itself out from use cases to also consumer adoption. So I think what Matt and I are going to try and do today is really talk about the implementation angle and what we're seeing from the perspective of an architecture and engineering firm. I am a trained lawyer, so I do the work I do at Stantec is I'm focused on policy and regulatory issues and governance from the implementation angle. And so I work with people like Matt, who I'll let introduce himself in just a second, to really think about how do we make sure the policy, regulatory, and governance structures align with the reality on the ground. And I think that's something, I definitely want this group to chime in on. I'm sure a lot of people here are involved with TRB. I love going to the TRB conference, but it seems like, the issues that the papers that are being presented are about issues and challenges from 3 to 4 years ago. And so it's kind of like, is there a way to make that process more nimble? And I threw in a quick image from a recent paper that we did with Buffalo. I can put the link to the project in the chat, but it was a smart streets design plan. And what we came up for them was kind of what I was describing in my intro is, how do we make sure that we come up with a new process that can help communities evaluate a technology, do the demonstration part of a project, think about design, think about future-ready infrastructure, and kind of have a more adaptable, flexible approach to this. And a big part of that is going to be data. A big part of that is staffing and resources, and then how you communicate, those findings to the public as well. So the community engagement piece is probably the most complicated. I think we're experiencing right now, not just from accessing every member of a community, but also, making sure that we can communicate, what is the role of technology. So I'll stop talking and let Matt introduce himself.
Sounds good, Greg. So yeah, Matt Davis. I'm based out of our Nashville, Tennessee office, and I lead our ITS practice. And very, very interested in this discussion today. Looking at where mobility is headed and a lot of the different infrastructure components that go into transforming, how we move around and get from A to B, and how we can best support that, what some of the challenges are that are in the way, and how we might be able to overcome some of those aspects. So starting that conversation on the engagement side, like Greg said, is the right place, and being able to educate from a technology standpoint of where are we at right now from a technology standpoint, and what are the major hurdles, what's real and what's just kind of being presented as something that's real but isn't really there yet, is some of the challenges that we have to look at overcoming and help around the education piece.
Great. Thanks, Matt. So one of our goals, as you see in the last bullet, is I try to make things as interactive as possible. So you'll see me throwing questions into the chat. I just threw one about whether or not anybody on the line has ridden in an autonomous vehicle. So please feel free to answer that. That's helpful for us as we move forward. And then please ask questions as we go along into the chat. And we might pause, or we might save things for the end, and we might even ask you to speak. So be ready. So I think kind of to the point that Professor Sarkis made around AI isn't something that's new. Matt can chat about that a little bit with some of our AI work, but it does seem like there's a cycle of excitement around technologies. You can see that picture on the right, which is from USDOT's website, but the concept of autonomous vehicles is nothing new. The concept of flying cars is not new. AI in my opinion, is, like Professor Sarkis said, like a new way to leverage computer power, but it's still about this underlying foundation of data and trying to figure out how can we do analysis more quickly and efficiently. And kind of where we come at this is really thinking about, like, where are we from a transportation perspective? What role does technology play? And in order to, I'll be referring to things as transportation 3.0. My own personal opinion is it does feel like we're at this inflection point where we need to determine what role will technology play in our transportation future, and whether or not we will leverage technology in a way to fix what many believe are problems with the transportation system. So transportation 1.0, horse and carriage, right? You're riding a horse. 2.0, combustion engine, arguably led to the influx of personally owned vehicles here in the United States, led to the creation of the national highway system. Again, very much determined by that car ownership perspective, and then led to a lot of challenges that, at least within US DOT and this administration, is looking to solve. So how do you overcome some of the disconnections that were created by the placement of a highway system that divided communities? And now you see a movement from US DOT to really think about how do you take down some of these highways and then promote, more social benefits related to transportation, which is the third bullet point. And I think that's a big question mark that we have. So it's great. We are investing in autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles to hopefully promote safety. But, how do you make sure that the other things happen as well? So the equity side of things, the sustainability side of things, the efficiency, because if you've worked in this space and you've read a lot of the papers, there's what people like to call the heaven and hell scenario. So heaven is everything moves seamlessly and we spend less time in vehicles. The hell scenario is that everybody has their own autonomous vehicle and there is increased congestion because people live farther away from their workplace or don't mind driving more. And they don't mind because they're not driving. They can do everything else in their car. So like Professor Sarkis was talking about working from home, you may be working from your car now, sleeping overnight in your car, things like that. So
And there's
yeah.
Just to add on to that, Greg, the zombie car effect as well of, instead of cars dropping, you parking your car at work and it's sitting there all day, it's out wandering around being used as a shared use, mobility vehicle during the day. So you actually have a higher VMT.
Absolutely right. And so, how do we manage all that? And that leads perfectly, Matt, thank you, into, the infrastructure conversation, right? So it's not just using the infrastructure, whether it's pickup and drop off zones, rethinking those, are there going to be dedicated lanes, but how do we charge for the use of that infrastructure? And I think that is a big conversation point here in the United States that arguably should be going on right now, but isn't for political reasons. But eventually, as you're pushing, for example, zero emission vehicles into the transportation system, these vehicles are no longer paying the gas tax, which is a major revenue source for transportation infrastructure. How are we going to reconcile that with the impacts of your use of the transportation system? And there are a number of academic papers. I expect that to pick up, and that merges a lot with our work on toll systems as well, that I think Matt will get into a little bit. So just, some recent trends. So Matt and I, one of the projects we get to work on a lot with together is we're working with the Louisiana Department of Transportation on a CAV working group. I do want to point out that we say CAV together just for the purpose of this presentation. They are two separate technologies. Autonomous technologies really, depends on the capabilities of the vehicle. So the Waymo vehicle that you see on the screen, that has LiDAR, which is radar to sense where other vehicles are, where people are. That has a camera system and a number of sensors along the vehicle. And that is, the autonomous side of things. There is no connectivity between the vehicle and another vehicle, and no connectivity between the vehicle and infrastructure. When you say connected vehicles, that is a separate technology where you're talking about, those connection points with potentially other vehicles and technology. Hopefully the two merge, but we have yet to see that happen. When you think about safety and redundancy, it makes sense for vehicles to also be autonomous and connected. But if you ask industry, they don't want to talk about the connected side of things because there's this looming question, kind of to the last bullet point, of who's going to pay for the infrastructure to support the connectivity. And then, when we talk about infrastructure, it's really interesting to think about the broadband side of things as well. And that, again, merges with the blockchain conversation, because not only are you talking about connected infrastructure to make sure the vehicle works from a safety perspective, there is then introduces the extra layer of cybersecurity when it comes with all this and data sharing. In working on the Louisiana project, these are some trends that we're talking about with the group that we just wanted to throw on the screen to share some extra context. I don't know if you want to add anything to this, Matt.
Yeah, I'll just chime in as well around the connected piece. Yeah, I think there's been a lot of concern from the OEM, like the auto manufacturer side, around the lack of consistency across the country. Even just within the United States or just within Canada, then you go global, and it's even a whole nother ballgame when it comes to the actual manufacturers and technologies on the connected infrastructure side of things. There's a lot of variability on the data language that each vendor uses. They've got their own, specific software coding and all of that that goes into their products, and there's reasons behind that. Obviously, they want to have their own proprietary sales pitches that they can give to different agencies, and you can only do this with our product. But then it becomes an issue when an automaker is just trying to make their product, their car, work across the board. Now they're having to work with 20 different vendors that are using different protocols and all of that, and that's trying to be standardized, but we haven't really gotten to that point yet. And so there's a lot of issues around that. And then there's also the maintenance side of the infrastructure, and a concern from the OEMs about if we're going to make our car rely on connectivity to infrastructure, we have to have some sort of assurance that that infrastructure is going to be highly available. In the realm of talking servers and things like that, you talk in number of nines, so like 5 nines of availability. Our infrastructure isn't really built for that currently, so trying to figure out how to make our infrastructure that we have out there more resilient and be able to operate through adverse conditions to where there's some assurance to the automakers that they're going to have that connectivity at most of the time is an important piece as well that has led to some of that apprehension on putting too much emphasis on the connected piece.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And I think kind of what we're hitting on too from a funding perspective is this is not cheap. For those that track the news, I mean, Google just invested another $5 billion into Waymo to support the deployment of autonomous vehicles. That is a tremendous amount of money, and Alphabet is very lucky to have Google as its parent company to be able to support that investment. So I think, one of the challenges we need to be thinking about for the future is, not just how to pay for the infrastructure that's needed, but how will transportation be priced? Here in the United States, even when you think about transit, I don't think there's any transit agency that gets full fare box recovery. So by fare box recovery, I mean 100% of revenue to cover operating costs. There's no agency that's able to do that. Even when you think about Lyft and Uber, they were heavily subsidized by venture capital. I still don't think Lyft or Uber is making profit on their ride sharing. Uber, more of its profit comes from the delivery side of things and Uber Eats. So kind of just this looming challenge of transportation is expensive, right? And so if we are going to make sure that autonomous vehicles meet those positive social benefits, including equity and accessibility, and a lot of companies like Tesla that happen to scream, pitch a van and a whole system that arguably is set to compete with transit, how do we make sure that a certain percentage of the population that doesn't have access to a vehicle or cannot afford premium services doesn't get left behind from a transportation perspective? So that's a very difficult policy question that I think we're wading into on the autonomous side and connected side and the technology side. And it's also, merging with the workforce conversation as well. So as we were putting together this PowerPoint, of course, Mr. Musk makes his pronouncement around, his network of vehicles that will be in production at the end of next year and operating seamlessly, in 2026, I think is what he said. And again, I don't know, I'd love to hear what you all think. I'll throw in another chat question into here. The number of conversations I've had in a week following this announcement, I've been kind of surprised that everybody all of a sudden thinks, oh, we can do this now because Tesla has made this announcement that they are investing in doing this. And I think it, in my opinion, has done a little bit of a disservice to all the challenges that are still there around trying to get autonomous vehicles into place. And one of the biggest ones in the US is the safety regulations, right? So in the United States, vehicles are regulated by what's called Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. All the auto companies self-certify their compliance with those safety standards, but the power of the U.S. Department of Transportation through the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, is the recall, approach that they take. So if a certain amount of vehicles end up having safety issues, then they look at the data and they talk with the manufacturer and they say, we think you have a system-wide problem. You need to issue a recall. And so that's why if you ever got one, you get that notice of a recall, you take your vehicle into the dealer and they check to make sure there's not a safety issue. And if there is, they replace it for free. So the deployment of autonomous vehicles at scale is starting to create a complicated ecosystem because the safety standards on the federal side of things have not caught up with autonomous vehicles or even assisted driving technologies like lane assist and side view cameras, right? That is still, there's no safety regulation in place requiring that. It's, a lot of systems have it, but, there is a little bit of a gray area there around how the federal government will be able to regulate and then to what standards, as Matt was starting to talk about, are these vehicles, being manufactured. So if you look at the recent news in about a week, Elon Musk has since, said he will be a part, if the Trump administration wins, he'll be part of the Trump administration. He's going to really be the driving force around regulations for autonomous vehicles. He's going to set up a whole department of efficiency. So it shows that even he knows it isn't as easy as he said, but he thinks that he can help influence the conversation and speed things up. What he forgets is, not to be complicated, but I'll put on my lawyer hat, there is a whole layer of the court process that comes into play here. And so in the event that NHTSA does put forward these new regulations, they can all be challenged in court. And it could take 1 to 10 years to finally litigate all that. And when you're dealing with cases of first impression, and that's what they're called when there's something completely new, which they will be around autonomous vehicles and safety standards, that is something that could end up all the way up in the Supreme Court. And that takes a number of years. So it's kind of a reality check, I guess. That's kind of the play on the question. Is it really that easy? So I did put a chat in there, or a quick question of whether or not, people are tracking this. And if the Musk conversation changed your viewpoints. But anyways, it's very interesting I think the power of messaging, right? And we can get into that a little bit more during the Q&A. Quickly, just want to put up, the three kind of layers of technologies that we're thinking about. I haven't even said once the word flying drones or flying cars, but the advanced air mobility conversation is very, very relevant right now in the United States and getting a lot of federal lobbying, which is pretty interesting. And we're tracking that very closely. Then you have, of course, zero emission vehicles. It's full steam ahead on the funding side. Again, my own personal viewpoint, not Stantec's, is that you have a lot of funding being pushed forward without actual national regulations quite yet. So the administration took the perspective that we needed to get funding out there and stimulate the investment in the technology in charging infrastructure. We are still working through issues related to interoperability, the consistent use of the right charger to comply with all vehicles. And there's this complicated aspect of utility coordination that's coming up and how to, fuel, empower the future of communities. And that is also merging with the complications around data centers. And here in the US, there is this rebirth of conversations around nuclear power, which is pretty amazing to me. When 10 years ago, nobody wanted to talk about it because of the waste issues. But now, because there is so much demand for power, nuclear is seen as a clean option. So very interesting, again, how pressures of innovation can change policy conversations very quickly. And then, of course, autonomous and connected vehicles. And kind of in the middle of the triangle, a lot of these are policy and regulatory issues that we've talked about really quickly, and that I would argue are the foundation to getting the future right. And when we talk about Transportation 3.0, a big part of our work that I work with Matt on, and I come at from the policy and regulatory perspective, is I do not, again, my personal view, I do not think we can continue to operate within these existing governance and regulatory structures because they do not align with Transportation 3.0. And so if you want to transform the transportation system, you need to transform the foundational structures that enable the funding, the contracting, the land use side of things. And that is what I would argue are the hard things that nobody likes to talk about in detail. But if you invest in that on the front end, I think you could streamline the implementation of the technology or integration and avoid problems on the back end. So happy to dig into that further, but in the interest of time, want to keep things moving so I can turn things over to Matt. And then this is a chart that I came across in the last couple of weeks from a law firm, Baker Donaldson. It does a nice summary of the way different states are approaching AV regulation. Again, not connected vehicles, these are just autonomous vehicles. There's still a very large distinction between testing and piloting versus commercial operations. Very few states allow the actual commercial operation of autonomous vehicles. So it shows we're still very much in this kind of testing phase of the technology. But if Waymo continues its success and Tesla, meets its ambitions, then we will be built more of in a commercial operation state. So will states continue to have to do that, or will the federal government catch up and feel pressured to put regulations in place? To me, it's always interesting that a third of the states have not taken any action. So they're kind of more of in a wait and see approach. Let's see how this breaks down. And it kind of makes sense when you think about the different layers of government. So the federal government in the US does have clear jurisdiction over the safety and operation of vehicles. But when you get to the regulation of the driver, that is where states have their power. So again, a very interesting regulatory question is, if you remove myself from my vehicle and the vehicle is completely driven by the computer now, which is a installed part of the vehicle, does that regulation then shift to the federal government where individual states no longer have the power to do driving tests? And I think that's a really interesting question that I have yet to get a good answer on, but it's to me, it's a good kind of litmus test. If you ever want to check somebody on whether or not they're an expert, ask them that question and see what the hell they respond. And then that, all these gray areas we're talking about, are putting pressure on NHTSA and this call for the federal government to take more action. So I'm going to turn things over to Matt now. Again, this is just an image. One of the great things about working at Stantec is we have so many great visuals that we're ever able to create with our designers. And this was, a concept of a community charging hub. And I think this really points out these new synergies we need to be thinking about. This one obviously is focused on electrification, and the idea of kind of a shared use mobility charging hub where, you could get a vehicle that's fully charged and switch that out and park it and go someplace else. Or you could hop in a bike, an e-bike or a scooter, take that out, or, hop in an eVTOL and potentially go out to more suburban rural areas. So, and the main point of this, of one of those synergies, is you need to coordinate now transportation with energy. This could have been repurposed from a gas station if you think about it. This is a new kind of fueling station for the future. And we haven't even talked about data yet. So I'll turn it over to Matt, because that is what he's going to be talking about.
Sounds good, Greg. Yeah, it's interesting. I watched a lot of YouTube videos, and I watched one this weekend around a truck driver in Germany that his company's doing a fleet transition to EV trucks, and watching his experience basically of calculating out where he's going to do his brake times, when he'll do his brakes, mandatory brakes, all that kind of stuff, and looking at the charging infrastructure that's available, how he decides which charging infrastructure to use based on cost, ease of getting in and out, what amenities are available as part of those break periods. So everything you just talked about on the last slide. It's interesting watching that like come to fruition and people going through those different experiences. But yeah, jumping into a few other things around mobility. There's as we look into the future, I think a lot of our traditional, at least from a transportation engineering perspective, a lot of our traditional skill sets have been around like geometric design, understanding drainage, understanding even from a traffic engineering perspective, maybe understanding some traffic flow theory and designing traffic signals and putting together some traffic signal timing. But with the new wave of this mobility 3.0, there's a lot of new data, or, I'm sorry, a lot of new skill sets that are required to accomplish this. So looking at data, cybersecurity, looking at performance measurement, data analytics. There's just a wide variety of new skill sets that are needed in the industry. One of the challenging things is that traditionally, architecture engineering, our primary focus is working with state governments, state agencies that are not, they're already struggling with funding. So trying to find talent that is, going into the tech industry, working for Microsoft, Amazon, places like that. From a salary perspective, it's hard to compete and trying to win those people over and keep them in our industry. Like I know I've had several folks work for us that just really, really brilliant data scientists and have a really good computer science background, and they'll kind of get their career started and then they're off to work in the automotive industry or the tech industry, and I can't blame them, but but it's tough because we need that skill set to make this work, and so that's where we're trying to bring more attention to the transportation industry and show the value that if you're a part of this industry, what you can bring to the table to improve overall quality of life for everybody. and it's an exciting thing to be a part of. So that's some of the trends I guess we're seeing in the future mobility. If you want to go to the next slide, Greg. One of the other things around data, I'm sure everyone is hearing a lot about artificial intelligence or AI, similar to what Greg had up on the first slide around the Jetsons and some of the vision for the future that's been around since the 60s. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with movies like The Terminator, or war games. Like a lot of 80s movies, there was this big emphasis on artificial intelligence. Even like 2001: A Space Odyssey, going pretty far back. And this whole concept of artificial intelligence and the robots taking over. And I think now it would kind of come full circle of like this rejuvenation of the excitement around AI, with large language models and all of the new things with Copilot and GPT and things like that. So it's kind of a resurgence in that realm. But at the core of it, AI is only as good as your data inputs. So it all kind of comes back to a strong data foundation, and we're looking at different ways that we can prepare for the use of artificial intelligence, with the resources we have available now. So understanding that um, the the ability to do things with artificial intelligence is getting easier and easier and more feasible. But it all starts with good data. So some of the things we're looking at with our clients is, as an example, is the AI ready analytics engine, where we can take a lot of processes that we're doing in a more manual manner right now, like project identification, project prioritization, understanding how we need to identify opportunities or challenges really in going to Mobility 3.0. So we're looking at ways we can consolidate data. I'd spoken earlier a little bit about how there's different manufacturers out there for all of our infrastructure around traffic signals, all of our intelligent transportation systems infrastructure. And a lot of those different vendors have different data formats that they use. And so at the end of the day, a DOT or a transportation agency, they may have 3 or 4 different vendors that they're using for different aspects of their system, and or more. And all of the data is in these different kind of silos. So one of the early foundational things that can be done is trying to do some data fusion, to get all of that information into one singular data set. And once you have a unified singular data set in place that all of your outside information is feeding into, you can start making informed decisions from that point forward and start to automate those processes. So that's one of the things that we're looking at, from this perspective. And I think this is going to play a big role in the connected and automated vehicle space as well. Back to my earlier point, basically about, right now, there so much of the data is so disparate. So trying to centralize this data as much as possible and unify the formats is going to be important. You go to the next one, Greg. Thanks. I know Greg kind of hit on a lot of this already, but just a quick rehash of the policy and regulatory landscape, specifically for an AI perspective. This is uncharted territory, basically, and we're seeing a lot of state DOTs here in the U.S. Start to implement or try to come up with AI frameworks and policies for their organizations, to at least put some sort of guardrails in place around how it's being used, who has access to their data, um, you know, how they want to store their data, um, ethical considerations. There's a lot going on there, and then also from a federal level, there's a lot of research and investigation ongoing around how AI may be governed from a federal level, at least here in the U.S. Feel free to chime in anything else on that, Greg. That's your area of expertise. um, and then another, I guess, real world application of AI where we're currently supporting the implementation and use of artificial intelligence around transportation infrastructure is a really cool project here in Nashville that we've worked on with Tennessee Department of Transportation, Vanderbilt University, and Southwest Research Institute. And this is basically a smart corridor that's using integrated corridor management strategies. And there's been over 1,000 intelligent transportation system devices deployed in this corridor that connects Nashville to a suburb called Murfreesboro. And as part of that, there's these variable speed limit and lane control gantries that have been installed every half mile along the corridor with the goal of helping to smooth out traffic flow and reduce the number of rear end collisions along the corridor. Basically, trying to give as much advance notice as possible to drivers that there's a slowdown ahead and they need to start reducing their speed to accommodate that so that they're not hitting a big stopped queue by surprise. And as part of this, there's been a lot of other decision support systems deployed across the country in the past, and they've all been run by simulation modeling, which is very labor intensive to set up. You have to calibrate the model. Anytime something changes, you have to go in and make those changes in the model to get an accurate response out of it. And it takes time running those simulations. Even with a supercomputer, you're looking at 5 to 10 minutes to get a response out of the system as to how to respond if there's an incident on the roadway. So this is a new approach to infuse a multi-agent reinforced learning model algorithm to act as the decision support system. And with that, we've gone from 5 to 10 minutes to get a response down to a matter of seconds. And that's with a very minimal hardware resource required in order to make those decisions. And we've gotten really good responsiveness out of the variable speed limits. There's also a diversion routing component. So if there's a large closure on the interstate, we can divert traffic onto the arterial network that runs parallel and make changes to the traffic signal timing plans that are running to try to improve the rate at which we're able to push vehicles through the overall arterial network. And we're seeing very promising results in the reduction in number of crashes, especially. I don't have the numbers here, but when we look at a zoomed out view of what's happening regionally on the adjacent I-65 South corridor and I-40 East, unfortunately, those corridors have seen double-digit increases in number of crashes and fatal and serious injuries, while we're seeing reductions in this corridor. So there's definitely a safety impact occurring here. And on the one more thing I'll add in is on the back end of this, to the slides I just talked about, we basically centralize the data that's coming in to inform the AI into a central database. So we have this single database that's informing the AI-based decision support system, and then that's sending information back into that database to push out to the field devices and to the traffic management center operators. So again, we did a lot of work up front unifying that database and getting that one point of truth, basically, of what's happening on the corridor and what elements need to be considered, that then set up the ability to deploy a system like this.
Yeah, Matt, and one thing I want to jump on here is the reason we're talking about this a little bit is it goes to the implementation side of things. So again, like these are all layers, in my opinion, that will support the safe and effective operation of autonomous vehicles. If you have this in place, then it should be seamless to integrate autonomous vehicles, which may or may not need all this, but likely will. But it does beg this larger question, again, of why are we spending $5 billion on autonomous vehicles when you could arguably introduce these systems And if you added a layer of enforcement, you could make sure you could kind of force people or change behaviors uh, to have them operate as safe as computers. I mean, you can't be as safe because humans need to sleep, but then it decreases, some of the cybersecurity concerns and things like that. So
Right.
I'm not trying to say we shouldn't invest in autonomous vehicles, but it does beg the question around why, and are we making the right investments?
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to that point, Greg, about the cost of the infrastructure to build out this specific system and what the alternatives could be in the future on a more direct connected system and how that would look. So if this 40-mile-per-hour speed limit is popping up in your heads-up display in your car, or the car automatically reacting to that change in speed just based on receiving a message from the roadside, allows you to potentially get rid of a lot of this infrastructure build out. So there's a number of variables of like where we're at now to where we're headed and what it looks like in between.
Right. Thanks, Matt. And as I change the slide, the other thing I want to throw on too is, a lot of people are also hearing about vehicles reporting data to their insurance providers. So again, if you have this data that's going to your insurance provider and arguably putting you into this place that characterizes you as an unsafe driver, paying an extra amount for insurance should change your behavior as well. So it's very interesting to see how all these things that Matt is talking about influences the kind of policy, and we haven't even got into the consumer behavior side of things.
Right. Yep. If you want to skip ahead, Greg, I know we're getting
Sure.
short on time.
Sounds good.
Real quick, I'll hit on this. Basically, kind of where that to the point of what I just said of where we're at now and where we're headed. The conversation around connected vehicles for a long time has been that bottom connection, the infrastructure data to vehicle data, and having a direct line of communications between the two. And that relies on having that dedicated spectrum, the 5.9 gigahertz that you guys may have heard of, for dedicated short range communications, or DSRC. And at least here in the US, unfortunately, the FCC has given away a major chunk of that spectrum. Not given away, they sold it off. So there's a monetary value to it, but it is it's been taken away from infrastructure, and really narrowed what can be achieved through that spectrum. There is still bandwidth there available for that connectivity, but there's definitely I would say a trend of moving away from that concept and digging into what ITS America has recently coined as V to N, or vehicle to network. So basically, you're going through a third party provider to get that connectivity between a vehicle and another vehicle, or a vehicle and infrastructure, a vehicle and a pedestrian, that whole V to X scenario. And you're going to be going through your third party navigation providers. You're going to go through um, ultimately through the cellular network as a form of communications, but there'll be some other entity that's aggregating the data and disseminating that out. So that's kind of seems to be, in my opinion, where the industry is headed, and this uncertainty around DSRC and how the communications ultimately will work out is one of the things I think that's caused some holdup in seeing more widespread rollout of the technology. But in my opinion, it seems to be changing with that trend towards the vehicle to network.
Yeah, and the legal term, Matt, is the court determined that it was abandoned, not taken away. But we can argue about that.
Right.
But it does. I mean, again, I think you're right. Like this looming conversation, I mean, that I'm very interested in. So hopefully you all are getting ideas for papers and research. We are always happy to partner on research too. We do a lot of that with universities and professors to really try and merge the research with the implementation side of things. But I had this basic question of, if we go back to that hell scenario where we're all hanging out in our cars, streaming movies, riding your Peloton, like, is there enough spectrum to accommodate all that and arguably prioritize safety? And I don't know the answer, but I think it's something that people are starting to look at a little bit more closely.
Yeah, and it's an important point, Greg, because I mean, how many times, even with 5G on your phone, you just want to load a simple video and you can't. When it matters that a vehicle's running a red light or is about to run a red light and there's a pedestrian in the intersection, um, it's important that that communication's there. And if you're relying on a cellular network that you can't really rely on now to do a simple task, it's not ideal.
Right. And we haven't even touched on disaster response. And for those, I mean, we have colleagues that were working in Asheville, North Carolina right now. I mean, not only did you have roads washed out, but you also had no access to cellular connection. So how will these technologies operate in those types of environments and with increasing, intensity of weather events? So I do want to switch to Q&A to make sure we answer any questions. I will quickly flash on a screen. This is a research project we did with the New England Transportation Consortium. I'll send the slides to you, Dr. Aswathi. There's links to this report in there, and I also put a report on our Smart Streets design plan. But the goal of that project was how to support the seamless operation of autonomous vehicles across state lines, and that proved to be a very complicated conversation. So again, the link to that report is in the chat or in this deck, so I'm happy to talk about that offline. Here's some concluding thoughts, but I definitely want to see if anybody has any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Greg and Matt, for finishing on time. And I now open the floor for questions. Very insightful presentation on autonomous mobility. There are several students in the audience who are pursuing their research in the area of autonomous vehicles. Some are into how the energy management for autonomous vehicles could be managed. There are others who are also looking into infrastructure planning problems. So you shared one document on Buffalo Smart Streets design. I think it would be very useful for the audience. Thanks again. And last but not the least is that autonomous vehicles are what we are looking up to. We hold this as new transportation system, not only for the environmental benefits, but also as innovative transportation options. So there is a lot of research to go into how to make them, one of the favorite transportation options for the commuters or people when they will become, one of the preferred options for people who are looking for clean mobility and urban mobility and many more areas. I will now not take much time and pass on to others so that they can ask questions to the speakers. I give the floor to the audience.
Speakers. I'm Dr. Mohammed Monti. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
So just I have a question. Can these manual cars be converted to AI-driven cars? Suppose, let's say the lifetime of a car is 15 years, right? And those cars, suppose I owe a car which cost me in lakhs. Now I don't want to just put it in some less amount or to give it away. So what I want to say, can it be like smart hybrid cars where it will be completely AI driven? That is my question.
You want to go first, Matt, or you want me to go? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the company, and there's probably multiple out there, but I know that there's definitely companies in the market space that are aiming to do just that. So I know it's going to vary a lot based on the type of vehicle as well. Of everything from some vehicles have hydraulically driven steering, power steering versus electric power steering. Um, there's different levels. You know, every vehicle has different levels of electronic aids built in already. So a lot of those different aspects go into the compatibility of those technologies and what's required. Um, and then I guess the other thing I'll say there is if there's a range of different types of vehicles that are supported by that type of automated vehicle add-on, um, it's probably going to be your more popular vehicles at the top of that list that get that kind of support first. So your best-selling, Toyota RAV4, maybe F-150 trucks, like those are the type of vehicles that you'd see as targets, just because there's a higher sales potential there. But yeah, that's definitely something that I know folks within the industry are looking to be able to implement.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it gets to the aftermarket part of this. And again, there's a huge gap, probably a bigger gap than vehicles themselves, this aftermarket part on the regulatory side. And a couple of quick thoughts, right? It's going to depend on the existing computing power of the vehicle, right? So you think about your iPhone right now. Like, I cannot update my iPhone anymore because it doesn't have enough storage. And even if I wanted to update to the new iOS, this chip is not strong enough to handle all the new stuff, right? So how is that going to merge? And that's where it's interesting to think about the Rivians of the world, the Teslas of the world. They are investing in their vehicles from this technology perspective to be able to do over-the-air software updates, whereas some of the other vehicle manufacturers are just catching up to that, the more traditionals, the Toyotas, Hondas of the world. And it also gets to, I think Professor Anjali mentioned some research that's going on, the recycling of vehicles in the future. Like, I like this concept of being able to keep vehicles in perpetuity, but talk about a whole new e-waste situation. You're going to have vehicles with essentially computers in the trunk. How are we going to dispose of those safely as we're trying to figure out how to dispose of lithium batteries as well? So there's a whole, e-waste disposal conversation that is picking up and needs to pick up faster.
Thank you a lot.
Of course. Thank you. Any other questions? We can talk for hours.
I have a question regarding implementation. So from your experience, what would be the first or one of the very few kind of top hitters that's preventing autonomous vehicles to be implemented at large? You've mentioned regulations and policy, but apart from that, what area is the main hitter that's preventing a lot of the implementation right now?
I can start first, and I'm sure Matt has opinions. Mine is that regulatory kind of conversation of, is it a matter of updating existing regulations to accommodate autonomous vehicles, or do we need to develop a whole new, for lack of better words, vehicle code for autonomous vehicles? And then that merges into the complicated conversation, which is kind of like dovetails, is the mixed fleet part of all this. My personal opinion is robots and humans cannot play nice on roads, which then gets into this conversation of needing dedicated lanes for autonomous vehicles, which gets very complicated from an equity, right-of-way management conversation, right? So to me, that's a perfect example of the convergence between the governance and infrastructure allocation. And I think that's holding this up a lot. I don't know, Matt, if you want to add on.
Yeah, I think there's still a technology limitation too. People probably don't want to acknowledge it, but I mean, you look at Waymo, and I would say, in my opinion, they're kind of the leaders in the automated vehicle space. I've ridden in several Waymos, and even within their fleet, they have different maturity levels of vehicles that have, some have more modern hardware, more modern software layered on top of that. And you can definitely notice a difference when you're in one of the older vehicles versus one of the newer vehicles as far as how smoothly it operates and all of that. And they started their deployment in probably one of the easiest operating environments in the US, in Phoenix, where the whole road network is basically a grid, and it's sunny, I don't know, 340 days of the year. Very little chance of snow, any of that. So the operating environment's very, very simple there. And they've been strategically and slowly expanding the operating environment to like San Francisco, where you've got hills as a challenge and some tighter streets. Now going to Austin and Atlanta. So they're starting to expand that out, but you don't see them operating in New York or Toronto or um, the Rocky Mountains. So I think there's still, even as advanced as they've gotten, there's still a lot of challenges that need to be overcome just from a technological standpoint. And some of it's to what Greg just said of that mixed traffic operation and being able to code a computer to react to an unpredictable human operating around that vehicle is a very, very big ask.
And then bullet point 4, I think, is a huge one to focus in on, the outreach and education that you see on the screen here. And I mean, again, not to say anything bad about our elected officials, but here in the US, and again, my own opinion, lobbyists run the show. And it's very easy for lobbyists to get access to elected officials to say this is the legislation you need. That might not always correlate with the capabilities of the technology and what might be needed from an infrastructure perspective. So how can we do that better? I guess I'll leave it at that.
All right. So that brings us to today's end of today's presentation. I'm very thankful to the speakers for accepting our invitation and helping our education outreach program in one way or the other. Thanks so much. And we will be sharing you the recording of the presentation once done, and look forward to having you with us another time in future. Thanks very much and have a great day.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.